So I'll speak in English. Thank you for coming. Good morning, everybody. Richard, thank you so much for making the time to be here with us today. Mauricio, thank you for the opportunity. It's not the first time we held a meeting together here. I hope it's not the last one. It has always been very fruitful from our perspective, so I hope it's also fruitful from the KPMG perspective. So it's a pleasure to be here again. Well, I don't need to introduce Richard Threlfall for you. You have his resume and the flyer all of you have received. I just want to highlight that he is in a unique position to give us a global perspective of the private investment in infrastructure. Of course, our focus here is Brazil, but Brazil is part of the world, right? The savings come from the same place, which is not from Mars, not from Jupiter, not from the moon. It comes from the planet Earth. So we are competing for funds which are available in great quantity in the world. The question is, are we prepared to take advantage of this glut of savings in the world economy? And this is the question I pose on the table. I hope you can answer this in the context of the international system in the area of infrastructure. The floor is yours, Richard, for about 30 to 40 minutes. So, and after that, we can open for a Q&A with the participation of all the attendees. So thank you so much again. So now I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sergio. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for the privilege of being able to come and talk to you today about a subject which I am hugely passionate about, which is infrastructure. I'm conscious that maybe we have in the room some individuals for whom infrastructure is not the only thing that they think about. So perhaps before I get into some of the specifics on the slides I've prepared, maybe I just do a little bit of a scene set for you about infrastructure globally. It is no exaggeration to say that the world is in the midst of an infrastructure revolution. It's a revolution which is being driven by an insatiable demand globally for more and better infrastructure. If we put it in terms of numbers, there are many estimates out there, but none of them are less than $70 trillion worth of investment needed in infrastructure in the world over the next period to 2050. Or to put it on a per annum basis, the world today spends about $3 trillion per annum every year on infrastructure, but the demand for infrastructure is that it needs between $6 and $9 trillion per annum to be invested in it. And what is driving this demand? In the developed markets, it is being driven by a desperate need to renew infrastructure, which in many cases was built 100 or 150 years ago and is no longer fit for purpose. And in developing markets, it is being driven by the demographics of growth of population, but more importantly, by the rising standards, the rising income of populations in countries from India to Indonesia to Nigeria to many of the countries here in the region in Latin America, where we need to invest for clean water, for schools, for healthcare facilities, for basic transportation. and of course for sustainable energy. And it is being driven by a recognition which now it appears in the last year the entire world has accepted, that we need to act in order to deal with the climate change, which has been the adverse consequence of the phenomenal progress that the world has seen, particularly in the last 40 or 50 years. So the demand, in particular, to drive infrastructure investments for sustainable energy is greater than anything that any of us will have seen in our lifetimes. So you can imagine that for an individual like myself, or indeed some of my colleagues at the table here, Mauricio and Charles and others, it's a hugely exciting time to be involved in this sector. But it's not just because of the scale of what is required in the world. It's also because, perhaps coincidentally, perhaps by tremendous good fortune, at precisely this moment, when the world needs to unlock all of this investment to achieve the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, we have to our rescue technology. Infrastructure, arguably the last industry on the planet to reach its technological revolution. And I will give some examples in a moment of where we are seeing that impact. But most infrastructure today is still being built as it would have been built 2,000 years ago. Stone and bricks and cement, maybe some more recent innovations like iron and steel. But technology is suddenly washing across the entire sector, and it is transforming our ability globally to be able to deliver what the world needs and to deliver it in the timescales that, in particular, the UN Sustainable Development Goals require. By the way, 73% of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, their success or failure depends on our ability to invest in infrastructure globally. So now let me look at a few themes and then reflect those back onto where Brazil stands today in infrastructure, which for me is also, and I know again for my colleagues, is a really exciting time. We've gone from the last time I was here about a year ago, when I think it'd be fair to say there was a degree of pessimism around the direction of Brazil in terms of its infrastructure investment, to a today, under this government, where it is clear that Brazil is open to the world to infrastructure investment. But still, to do that, I would argue you want to do an investment in the infrastructure of today, not the infrastructure of yesterday. So let us look at a few trends. So on the theme of technology, we are seeing the most dramatic improvements in the efficiency in which we can deliver infrastructure outcomes for society. So apologies if the graph is slightly unclear, but on the left-hand side, so this is showing the cost of wind power effectively to the consumer in the UK specifically, but it is mirrored through the world. And the timescale on the left, far left at the beginning of the chart, is 2015. So it is not that long ago. And on the far right, you have the prediction down to 2024, and in the middle you have approximately where we are today. The UK started running auctions for its wind capacity 4 years ago. using a very similar technique to that the Brazilian government is using for a lot of its infrastructure to run auctions with the private sector. And when it started, a colossal level of subsidy was required in order to make wind power economic. And moreover, the UK government even set up a specific green investment bank in order to underpin the risks that were perceived of building turbines in the North Sea. 4 weeks ago, in the third auction round for offshore wind in the UK, the government set aside a 65 million pot of subsidy, and at the end of the auction, they allocated precisely 0, because the market price had already dropped in 4 years to below the market cost of energy in the country generally. In other words, wind is now a 0 subsidy sustainable energy source in the UK. Look at solar. Again, the uptake of solar in the world has massively exceeded what anybody could expect. The far left is 1997, the far right is 2020. In March of this year, KPMG colleagues in the United Arab Emirates in Dubai closed the 4th round financing on what is today the world's largest single-site solar farm. It will produce 1.2 gigawatts of electricity from solar. 4.3 billion US dollars will be invested in that site, which will be fully operational within the next year. And I guarantee that its status as the world's biggest solar park will be overtaken within 12 months. Again, the ability of the world, because of technology, to deliver, in this case, another sustainable energy source, has gone off the scale in terms of its impact compared to what anybody expected. Of course, many of you will know the reason behind the particular success of solar has been largely because of the Chinese domestic market, which has demanded so much that the unit price of solar has fallen through the floor in, again, the period of only the last 5 years. Take another example, the cost of battery power in dollars per kilowatt hour. Over a period of less than 10 years, the cost has collapsed by almost 90%, and is predicted to continue to fall even further. And of course, many of you will recognize that the power of what is happening in batteries is not just an issue for energy, but this then has implications for what we can achieve in terms of transport, because what is happening here will drive the push towards the electrification of transport more generally. Now, I have given these particular examples in terms of the end user technologies of infrastructure, if you like, but the same technological advances are also being seen in terms of the physical delivery of infrastructure. So, for example, the rise of off-site manufacturing, the use of robotics within the construction industry, and so on. McKinsey has predicted that the world should be able to take out about 40% of the cost of manufacturing, of producing infrastructure, if the industry embraces the technologies which are already available today. The only issue is the actual adoption of those technologies within the industry. And that then is a question, if you like, for Brazil, a question for policymakers, a question also for private businesses who are procuring infrastructure in this country. What are you doing to encourage the supply chain of this business, of this industry? What are you doing to encourage construction businesses active in Brazil to adopt the technology which would allow you to have 40% more infrastructure outcome for the money that you invest? The efficiency gain that can be achieved in infrastructure today, everybody knows is phenomenal. But it requires action by the buyers of infrastructure to be able to force that cost down. There's an allied theme to technology, which is all around the role of data. In many ways, I would argue this is an even bigger issue in the industry. Now, this is a very familiar graph. Speed of data processing seems to be continuing to rise at a doubling rate every few years. But I put it up here because, again, for infrastructure, arguably, this is more important than for any of the other industries that have taken advantage of it over the last decade. Because when we provide the service to citizens through infrastructure, we are dealing with the entire populations of cities or the entire population of countries. We are trying to, for example, understand the movements of all vehicles within Brazil, or we're trying to track the movement of all goods around the world. 2 or 3 years ago, the world did not have the computing processing speed to be able to do those things, but today it does. And private businesses are competing to start to use data to both understand and in some cases to control those entire industries. So, for example, in the logistics industry, everybody knows today that there is not a line of sight of data between the factory, the truck that moves the good, the port that receives it, the ship that takes it across the sea, and so on at the other end. But the data capability to join up that entire line already exists. And all that's happening today is different companies are trying to create the platform to be the governor of that entire industry. We're in a world now where the Singaporean government has launched what it's called a digital twin strategy called Virtual Singapore. They are proposing to effectively create an entire digital picture of the Singapore city-state. Why? Because they want to be able to test whether their infrastructure interventions will have the effects that they want, and also to be able to prioritize the infrastructure that they invest before they spend billions or potentially waste billions of dollars of taxpayers' money to build it. Again, the technology to do that is already there. If we look at the operation of infrastructure assets, we're in a world today where, for example, Orange Telecommunications, the French mobile company, because they have been putting sensors on every single part of their mobile network, and because they are pulling the data off that in real time, and because they are running data analytics on that in real time, they now say that they have 7 days notice of the potential failure of any component on the system, and therefore a potential outage of the system. Similarly, EDF Energy outsourced a contract 18 months ago to a startup business out of India, which is monitoring all of their wind turbines in Europe. Within 8 months of collecting data, they could give 50 hours notice of the potential failure of any wind turbine. Because, of course, you're picking up the perturbations in the electrical signals, which start to give you a pattern of when you know one of them is going to cause a failure. And as we know, where this potentially takes us is the hugely exciting world in which the so-called Internet of Things. So again, this data processing power, particularly in a world where we get 5G, which is the advent of 5G is one of the sort of the key next steps to unlock all of this globally. But the potential, for example, at a city level, to be able to have a complete picture as a city manager, for example, of what is happening in a city, in everything from the movement of citizens around that city in order to, heaven forbid, optimize the traffic flows in Sao Paulo so that we can all get here on time, through to example to optimize the waste collection within the city. Again, all of that, from a technological and data point of view, all of that is possible today. The only thing that is standing in its way is the governance that sometimes requires public authorities to align and sometimes requires public authorities to align with private businesses in order to make it happen. And this brings us into the broader point about connectivity. Again, you probably look at this graph and say, well, we know all this. We know that basically the mobile revolution has reached saturation already pretty much in the world. It's starting to flatten off. Nearly everybody in the world, even in some of the poorest places, have access to a mobile phone. But the revolution hasn't stopped there, because it's what people are using their phones for. So, for example, in India, in the last 5 years, there has been a 65 times increase in the amount of data that is being used by the users of those phones. And we have seen, for example, through the revolution that is Uber or Grab or Lyft or any of these ride-hail companies, the ease with which consumers are willing to adopt the access to what is essentially an infrastructure service using their phone. It also takes us into the realms of, for example, smart efficiency use, monitoring of premises remotely, and so on and so on. And it enables this eventually, this thing called mobility as a service. For those that have not heard the term before, this is the idea that accessed through my mobile phone, I can simply work out from wherever I am today to wherever I want to go, what are my options by whatever mode. I don't need to read a map, I don't need to look up a timetable, I don't need to pay a fare to anybody. Just as we're used to in other industries, all of that back office sits on a platform behind. Huge sums of money are being thrown at this. The Economist estimated a few years ago that we were seeing the rise of a new multi-trillion-dollar business through mobility as a service. And I shall be in Israel in a few weeks' time, and Israeli startups are piling into this space, trying to effectively control the platform that is the interface between all of us as individuals and the way in which we access transport globally. Now, you may say to me at this point, so what has this got to do with the hard infrastructure that a country like Brazil needs? What about the road program, both in terms of the concessions and the new roads that need to be built? But all this is relevant because in the future you will still need the tarmac of the road, but you don't need anything else. You don't need road signs. You don't need to build gantries. All of that's a waste of money today. I was having a conversation yesterday, as Mauricio knows, with one of the country's toll road operators. Do you still barrier entry to the toll roads? Yes. Why? It's almost unheard of in most of the rest of the world now, because it's all relying on digital control. But of course, you need the governance behind it. You need the database. You need the system that tells you who owns the vehicles and so on. So again, what is the efficient way that Brazil can access the infrastructure that it needs in order to drive its economic development? And let me now turn to a bit of a negative in the story. So, Sergio, you said at the beginning that Brazil was part of the world, and this was about a competition in a sense. I don't think you used quite that word, but you would have been right if you'd said that Brazil is in a competition for the world's resources to invest in and build its infrastructure. In terms of money, in terms of private money, there is absolutely no shortage of it. In fact, the world is awash with institutional money that wants to invest in infrastructure. 100 times over the amount of projects that it can actually access. Nearly every sovereign wealth fund, pension fund in the world has a target to put at least 5% of its assets into infrastructure, and the total sum of that is more than the 80 trillion that the world needs, but they can't find the projects to invest in. So as a result of which, the actual allocation today of private institutional investment into infrastructure is less than 1%. The issue globally is all around the pipeline of projects and the ability of governments in particular, and some big multinational private buyers of infrastructure, to be able to bring projects to market on a risk allocation model that the private sector can invest. Now, one of the things that I think Brazil should feel really optimistic about today is the fact that under this new government, you have such a clear pipeline of projects to bring into the market under a concession model and in some cases under an auction model, which is the first thing that external investors look for. They want that certainty of pipeline. They want to know that if they are going to spend time understanding what it means to be an investor in Brazil, that is going to pay off in terms of multiple opportunities over multiple years. So the fact that you have stability, the fact that you have a clear pipeline of projects, and the fact that there is this transparency in government in terms of the progress that is being made to bring projects to market, these are all huge ticks. And by the way, they're huge ticks for Brazil at a time when the rest of the world is not doing a very good job of competing against you. In Europe, the yields for investment in infrastructure are really low, and investors generally are trying to put their money into higher risk, more emerging markets. So they want to invest in countries like Brazil. But many other countries have really struggled to be able to create that certainty of pipeline and that certainty of delivery. I could name many of them. Indonesia, for example, can produce a list as long as Brazil's of all the projects it wants to do, but its actual delivery of projects has repeatedly taken much longer than the government has said and the market expects. So the acid test for Brazil over the next year is, can you keep to that program? Can you deliver to the program that the government has set out, bringing the projects into the market? If you can, you will, I guarantee, you will have all the world's investors in infrastructure who are interested in emerging markets and LATAM, you will have them on your doorstep. And already you've seen through the last round of the airport auction, and also with the North-South Rail, you've seen that there is already an excess of investor interest, but I think you could do even better. I think if you continue, you will find that you will drive down even further the cost of that private investment into this market. Your risk, I would argue, is more in the actual physical delivery. And this is because, again, not specifically just in Brazil, but globally, the construction industry is increasingly struggling to be able to deliver all the infrastructure that the world needs. There are multiple reasons for this. There have been significant initiatives undertaken in the world in the last year to try to address it. For example, in Hong Kong, the government launched something called Construction 2.0 about 12 months ago, which is designed to try to offset the fact that the construction industry productivity has fallen for 10 years. And they are attempting to create a pipeline of projects that force more technology into the way in which the construction industry in Hong Kong delivers projects. It's not just Hong Kong. New Zealand government and industry signed something called the Construction Accord only 6 months ago. Same issue, same problem. There is a systemic instability in the construction industry globally. I know in Brazil you've had different reasons for some of that instability, but the fundamental issue globally has been construction industries operate on incredibly low margins, often only about 1%. They have very little future visibility of work. They tend to underbid in order to maintain their order books. And we have seen very high-profile failures of major construction businesses all over the world. So capacity is coming out of the market at just the time that the market needs more capacity in it. So I have seen nothing on this topic in anything that I've been looking at in Brazil, and I guess my advice is that it would repay many times over the effort here to just think a little bit now around how to ensure the robustness of the supply chain in order to deliver all the infrastructure that the country needs. The robustness in terms of ensuring that there is a sufficient deal flow and margin in that industry, but particularly because if there is a sufficient margin in that industry, then they will invest in the technology and the skills which will reduce the unit cost of delivery in the long run. So ultimately, we benefit. We as taxpayers, we as citizens, if we can make this industry more efficient, then we will pay less for the investment that drives the economic growth of this country. The last theme I wanted to pick up was one I touched on at the very beginning, which is sustainability. I think it is nothing more than extraordinary how in the past year the whole world seems to have recognised the importance of what is needed in terms of climate change in particular. But it's not just climate change, it's the whole of what is captured in the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. And if any of you are wondering what this multicoloured badge on my lapel is, it is those 17 colours. If I went back 18 months ago and I was to ask any of the big multinational companies what they thought about this topic, they'd say, we've got a sustainability unit over there, go and talk to them. Or if I had gone to any major investor 18 months ago and I'd have said, what do you think about this topic? They'd have said, it's important. They wouldn't really have believed it. The last year has seen the most tremendous shift. And the reason I've said risk or opportunity is because I know there's still a skepticism as to whether this really matters in something as hard-edged as infrastructure. But my message is, if Brazil or any other country isn't taking this seriously, you will very quickly find that you run into deep trouble in terms of your ability to deliver everything that you're trying to deliver. And the reason for that is because sustainability has gone mainstream. It is no longer about NGOs and individuals who've always believed in it. It has gone right into the mainstream of both corporate and financial life. This chart shows the increase in funds invested in so-called ESG assets, environmental, social and governance assets, the industry, the financial industry standard for what it means to focus on the outcomes to which money is used, not just the financial return. I don't think it's going too far as to say that every institutional investor today has already reached a position where they will not invest in anything which they cannot show transparently meets ESG criteria. Now, there is a slight challenge here because there is no universally accepted standard of what ESG criteria is. However, what is happening globally is businesses can see the way in which public opinion can suddenly turn on a business that is seen to be, in the public's view, not operating in a way that is sustainable or protecting the planet's sustainability or delivering quality of life for society. and the impact in a globally connected world on that company's reputation and ultimately its share price could be so dramatic that no board can afford to avoid this. Every year for the last 10 years, KPMG has run something called the Global Chief Executive Survey, Global CEO Survey. We have, over 10 years, tracked issues like, questions like, what do you think the biggest external risks to your business are? 3 years ago, sustainability was not on the list of the top 10. 2 years ago, it was in 4th place. This year, it's in 1st place. The significance of this is simple. I was in St. Petersburg at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum about 3 or 4 months ago, and I was approached by a Russian construction business that's also an investor in infrastructure. They were trying to get funding for a coal-based project in Siberia. And they said, we can't get money for this. Can you help us get money for this? We've been to all the multilateral agencies, we've been to the Asian Development Bank, the AIIB, we've been to the World Bank, we've been to a bunch of institutional investors, nobody will fund it. Can you help? Answer no. So we know today that already Brazil has a wonderful track record in terms of the amount of renewable energy that you have in this country. So this isn't to suggest that at a strategic level you need to be doing things that are fundamentally different, though I would put a question out there about push towards electrification in transport. But I do think it's important that the country is very clear that the strategy that it has for its infrastructure future is not simply about driving economic growth, but is also a strategy that ultimately delivers quality of life for citizens on a sustainable basis in the long term and protects the planet. And I think if you do that as well, you will protect, I guess the reason we're gathered here having this conversation, Sergio, you will protect what you're really seeking today, which is the access to the flow of external investor money, and in some cases strategic investor expertise into this country. And so I finish with this simply because I think that is such an important message, which may not have been, significantly debated yet, that I appreciate the opportunity to do so today. And I have no idea how long I've taken, but I hope that'll do.
Me neither, but it was so interesting, so pleasant that I let it go. I think you've covered a lot of ground. There's a lot of food for thought here. And anyone who wants to ask a question, please identify himself or herself. I can ask the first one just to kick off the conversation. I'm not an expert on infrastructure, but based on what you said, there's a huge opportunity to stimulate either attracting foreign investors or creating Brazilian firms that can provide services related to the monitoring and the management of infrastructure based on big data and artificial intelligence. Based on your experience around the world, is there any lessons that you can share of governments which have intelligently induced a whole package of investors to come, not only to build the infrastructure, but to run the infrastructure in a bundle of investments, including big data and artificial intelligence, in order to go one step beyond let's say, the physical aspects of infrastructure?
So there are some really good examples of governments which have reached out, if you like, to private businesses in order to start to exploit the opportunity that is here. because I think all governments recognise that it's not really their skill set to deal with these big data and artificial intelligence and predictive analytic questions, so they do need help. I'll give you a couple of examples. There is a very interesting experiment going on in Toronto, in Canada, at the moment, which some of you may have heard of. It's with Sidewalk Labs, which is the Google subsidiary, and it is an agreement between the city government in Toronto and Sidewalk Labs in relation to the regeneration of the so-called Toronto waterfront area of the city. Now, in the past, if you were a city government and you wanted to regenerate a part of a city, you would go to a private developer and an architect firm and so on, and you would build physical infrastructure. That is not what Toronto is doing. Toronto has gone to a subsidiary of Google to talk about how would you create effectively a next generation connected city? How would you deliver that Internet of Things type city region on the assumption that would potentially be much more efficient in terms of the way that the development would then serve users than if you just went ahead and did it today in the way that we've done in the past. Other example I will give you is in Saudi Arabia. Again, some of you may be familiar with this, but there is a project. Calling it a project seems a little bit unfair, actually. There is an initiative by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia called the NEOM project, NEOM, and it is to build an entire new city up in the northeast of Saudi Arabia. The scale of it is absolutely vast. It will end up, I think, potentially being a city that may not be quite the size of Sao Paulo, but it's that sort of level of ambition. But they want to build a city of the future, not the past. So they've said that they want a city which is designed on the basis of connected and autonomous and zero-emission vehicles in order to optimise the way in which people can move around the city, as well as to have effectively full digital connectivity of the entire city. So those are just two examples. I think it's fair to say this is still in its infancy. Everybody knows the capability is there. Everybody can see that there are these really exciting applications, but at the moment there's lots of sort of test cases, if you like, to see how it can work in particular examples.
Please go ahead. Identify yourself, and you need a microphone, yeah.
I'm Fernando Schmidt from Niner Capital. How do you see the future of energy? Do you think that wind, sun, and battery will take over?
Nice succinct question. Ultimately, it has to. The International Energy Authority's forecasts are, however, that for the next 20 years, notwithstanding the huge increases that we will see in renewable energy capacity, the world's consumption of coal in energy and oil will continue to rise. This is probably arguably from an infrastructure point of view, the biggest challenge facing the world today. The reason, of course, is because the huge populations, the huge population growth, and the huge rising living standards in countries like India and China mean that the demand for electricity is growing faster than those countries can invest in renewable energy. even though actually China is one of the world's biggest investors in renewable energy, even so, they are simultaneously building new coal-fired generation, both in their own country and across a whole swathe of the rest of the world who are willing to accept that Chinese money and technology. And I think this is a really significant issue for the world. I don't think it has really featured high enough in the climate protest debates. I don't think there is the realization that, notwithstanding everything I showed at the beginning of this presentation about the approaching cost parity of renewables, there is a fundamental demographic issue which we still need to try to solve.
Who else? I have you. Well, I have another question myself. It is, what are the factors behind the shrinking margins of the construction firms? You're technologically lagging behind, and is Brazil an opportunity for them in this respect to get here a wider margin that they get elsewhere?
So the construction industry's fortunes tend in any country to rise and fall with the economic position of that country generally. So, for example, I have charted back in the UK to 1970 the output of the construction industry compared to the change in GDP, and the two correlate almost exactly, except the construction industry always suffers worse because construction is an investment, so it's a discretionary spend. So as soon as a market retracts, construction volumes fall. Now the reason I say this is because there's actually nothing new about the difficulties in the construction industry. It's always been a low margin industry forever in time. And it's always had this position where when order books have fallen, they have taken an even thinner margin, or sometimes even a negative margin, just in order to stay in business, and then they hope to pick it up on the upside. What has changed is that the scale of the projects in the world and the complexity of the projects in the world has gone up and up and up. There's more technology in these projects, which in principle is a good thing, but the industry just isn't built to be able to invest, and arguably also in many cases doesn't have the skills within the industry. We have seen huge shortages in terms of, for example, the skill sets needed to be able to manage these very complicated projects. So the problem really is that we need the construction industry today to be changing, but it's stuck. And it's stuck without the margin to be able to, even the industry itself knows this, but they don't see the way out. And one of the risks for the industry is that, as has happened in other industries, they're completely disrupted by a business that they don't even expect. So, for example, Google does have a construction arm that most people don't know about, that is gently working away, thinking about a totally different way of doing it, or the way in which you might use, there's a growing market in off-site panelised infrastructure, which you would just create and ship around the world. But the developers of those are not the traditional construction industry. To the second part of your question, Sergio, yes, yeah. If Brazil deliberately created a framework which provided for the construction industry players from outside to be able to access more stability and a higher margin, again, you would have a queue at your ports in order to get involved in the market. And the sorts of things that I would suggest you should be thinking about is things like creating co-creation of innovation funds for the industry, for example. So if you were to, it's quite common in many countries to, for example, for aerospace or automotive or for something in defence, to have this really close relationship where both public and private money is being put into a co-investment pot. Construction needs that, but it needs the leadership of government to do it because the industry itself is too fragmented to create the initiative.
Is China a case apart in terms of the margins of construction?
Yeah, well, so there's a couple of countries that are case apart, China and arguably France, but for the same reason, which is they have this they have these integrated supply chains in the construction industry, and they have this very close relationship between government and industry, which means that they have stability in the long term.
Sergio.
I have two questions. First, you said that we have 80 trillion.
Sorry?
What? Oh, sorry. I'm Sergio Segal. I'm in construction. And I have two questions. First, you said we have 80 trillion around the world looking for projects, right? But after 2008, in the United States, which is a country that desperately needs to reshape its infrastructure, governments refuse it, one after the other, to invest in infrastructure, right? And we suppose the Americans have good regulation, they're used to private projects, etc., which is different in Brazil. Why is that? That's the first question. And what is your personal view when you look at Brazil? Because we are lagging in education, we have regulation problems, including when you look back to our history in terms of private and public relationship. We don't know exactly what our tax system will be in the next 360 days or maybe 2 years, because we are debating that. And finally, we don't have the construction companies any longer because they've been destroyed by corruption and etc. So I still think that we have a long way to go in order to attract this 80 trillion. So I'd like to hear from you.
Thank you very much. So your first question, this is a really interesting one. Infrastructure is an intergenerational investment. It requires every society, whether it's doing it explicitly or not. Is this working?
It is.
Yeah. Every society is making a choice between how much money it spends on itself, consumes today, and how much it invests for the future. It's not an explicit conversation in most societies, but of course in a country like the States, where many of the investment and tax decisions are subject to referenda at a local level, it is actually quite an explicit decision. And time and time again, government has been reluctant to effectively reduce the standard or the amount of money that goes into today's voting population in order to invest for their children and their grandchildren. Interesting question, what we do about that. There is an argument, sometimes when this debate happens in the UK, we say, well, the Victorians invested in sewage systems and railways and roads, which we are using today 150 years later. So maybe there's a moral obligation in the same way as they did to invest for the future. But actually the truth is different. The truth is the Victorians only invested in the sewage system when it became socially unacceptable to have London so polluted. they only invested in railways by doing it with private capital that nearly all went bankrupt, and so on and so on. So I think history suggests that perhaps sadly most societies are not altruistic to the future, and you need very strong leadership to be able to say, we will put 10% of our GDP into our future country's growth, which is of course what China has done for the last 10 years. They have had, courtesy of the political system, their 5-year plans have set out a very, very clear direction for how infrastructure will support the economic and political aspirations of that country. It has been the driver of, for example, the huge investment that they've made in rail connectivity between the major cities of China. I could go on, but you get the picture. It needs really strong political leadership to say, we will invest. Which then brings us to your second point. And I think, in a sense, the two slightly tie together. I don't deny that given where Brazil is starting from, this is going to take time, clearly. But if you were to start from scratch and say, for a mythical country that we've just created, what do you need to do in order to build your future, both in economic terms and in social terms, you would start by saying we need clear leadership around the investment that we're going to make. We need a clear pipeline of what we are going to do over time. We need a clear strategy for how we will bring private investment into this space. And these are things I can see Brazil doing today. Not a year ago, but today. Which is why I think I have some optimism. There's another philosophical point under this, which is, at some levels, I always argue, this is no different running a country from running a business. We have a certain amount of capital available, which in this case is the tax revenues drawn from the population. But if we want to grow, we need to borrow and invest. And if we invest in the right things that generate growth, then in 5 years' time we will have more tax revenue and we will be able to continue growing. We create a virtuous circle of growth. The challenge for Brazil today is you have such constraints in terms of your tax revenue investment in infrastructure, and you also have such constraint in terms of your ability to borrow or your willingness to borrow as a country. If those two constraints stay in place, your only choice is to draw private capital in under toll road concessions and all the sorts of things that you're doing. Is it the perfect answer? No, the perfect answer would be to do that in hand with more government borrowing, which arguably would be more efficient anyway. But is it a bad answer to bring that private capital in? No, it's not, in my view. And to complete the circle back to the first question, the reason it's not, the reason I always have been a long advocate for the role of private finance in infrastructure, is because it matches better the cost of that infrastructure spend with the beneficiaries in time. In other words, if you can borrow let's say you can borrow over 30 years or more, even maybe under a sort of 40-year bond for your infrastructure investment, you start to transfer some of the burden of paying for that infrastructure from today's generation to the next one. And that is actually fairer than this generation paying for it all.
Good morning. I'm Paulo Neto from USP, and I'd like to ask Mr. Threlfall about issues relating new technologies and jobs. The new technologies takes jobs away, or it matches new future for new generations?
Wow. No, this is another massive question. There is an argument that as the technology displaces one set of jobs, it creates others. We as KPMG actually sponsored a study that was done last year by a student at the Kennedy School at Harvard, looking at the impact on the taxi and trucking driver industries in America of an advent of mobility as a service, but also eventually autonomous vehicles. Now, this is a big issue. So some of you may know that truck driving is the biggest single employer in more than half of American states. So politically, it's a massive issue. And equally, taxi driving is clearly a huge employer of low-skilled. And then we could then make another jump into the construction industry, because of course the construction industry traditionally globally has been a big employer of low-skilled labour. Now what that particular study showed was two things. One, that a whole plethora of new industries would be created that would potentially have employment needs that would outstrip those that were being lost. However, the technological capability of those jobs was higher than the ones that were being lost before. And the implication of that is the desperate need for education systems in countries to be trying to equip citizens to be able to cope with the industries of the future rather than necessarily the industries of the past. The second thing that the study showed was this doesn't happen tomorrow. It takes time. Even on the most optimistic timescales, it would probably be 20 years before you reach the point where you didn't need a truck driver, and even then, you'd probably still need them. For example, manoeuvring within a city or a port. You just wouldn't need them for the long distance. And that 20 years does give you the opportunity to just allow individuals to retire and for effectively the industry to adjust itself. It's not the same as, for example, where in some countries an entire industry has collapsed overnight, in the way that the UK sort of collapsed its coal industry and created mass unemployment in certain towns and cities. There is time to sort it out. I'm not personally sure that fully answers this question. Myself and a number of colleagues have been debating for a number of years whether there is an inevitability that it pushes us to a world in which the amount of labour that needs to be committed in the world to do everything the world needs is less than it is today, even as the world's population continues to rise. And then you need to get into a much bigger debate than I suspect we have time for today about what is the implication of that. The UK Labour Party is all over the papers again today because they have said that they want to move to a 4-day week. That is in some ways a logical outcome of this thought process. Why do we work in many societies for 5 days out of 7 rather than 4? However, they're in the papers because they're in the middle of a row about whether doctors wouldn't work all week. and so I just think it's going to take a long time for these sorts of debates to play through. But I think it is arguably, alongside climate change, the question you've asked is the second biggest existential societal issue that will face us over the next 30 or 40 years.
Anyone else? You can just wait for the mic.
Fernando Schmidt from Niner Capital. How do you see the 5G technology? It looks like China is already way ahead of the rest of the world technology-wise. And seems also to me that 5G from China is way, way ahead from all over the world. And so this gap tends to be ridiculous in China's favor. Could you say anything about that?
So firstly, 5G is the next huge technology revolution in terms of everything that we've been talking about today, because it unlocks so much. With speeds that are probably going to be 100 times what we're used to today. If we are going to be serious about, for example, having autonomous vehicles, they can only exist in a world in which you have that speed of data transfer and also the ubiquitous coverage. You can't suddenly lose a signal. You have to have that constant signal. 5G today is really not proven at scale anywhere. But you're right, I guess courtesy of what's happened politically over the last 6 months, we've suddenly shifted into a world in which the expectation is that we will have rival global systems for it. And China is, by some estimates, about 5 years ahead of the rest of the world in terms of its development of that technology. If the implication of the position of the US government and some others is that they will not accept that technology into their countries, almost by definition, that will, for a period, hold back the development of those countries compared to what China will be able to do. But we're probably only talking 5 years, not 50 years. So then the question is, how significant does that come in the overall? But of course, in a geopolitical world in which we all know that the US ultimately is losing ground and China is gaining ground, those 5 years could be quite significant.
Anyone else? Mauricio, and then.
Well, Richard, you've been one of the, if not the person that has been talking about autonomous vehicle in KPMG worldwide, more about it. And the question is how the autonomous vehicle will really be a reality, in what time frame in developing markets which will be adopted earlier, and when, like, countries like Brazil will start using this technology, and what is the timeline? I know it's very difficult to say, but how that's gonna impact in what timing in different markets?
Thank you. Perhaps first I might explain why I'm so focused on autonomous vehicles, because when that technology becomes widespread, it will completely turn on its head our understanding of the way that transport operates in our lives. What do I mean by that? Today, we pay for transport. We pay for the act of moving. That is the thing that consumes money and cost. But in a world of autonomous vehicles, the value comes back to being the service you consume, and the fact that you can travel because you're not having to intervene in that act of travelling at all becomes entirely ancillary. So let me give you an example. It's your office, but it can move when you want it to. It's a school, or it's an educational facility. It can move when it needs to. It's a healthcare facility. It goes to where it needs to. These are the sorts of things that autonomous technology takes you ultimately into, and there's a big financial implication of that, which was spelled out by a Morgan Stanley analyst at the Detroit Motor Show I attended a couple of years ago, he said the marginal cost of transport falls to zero. It can't be quite technically right, but the provocation is this, that you in the future, you pay for the service that is wrapped around you in a thing that happens to move. You don't actually pay for the moving. And if you think that's far-fetched, you don't pay for this. Sorry, I put mine away. Nobody pays for this. The cost of producing this is negligible. You don't actually pay for the material or the thing. You pay for the service you use through it, and by extrapolation, the expectation is, in a word of autonomous vehicles, that you don't ever pay for the actual transport any longer. You pay for the suite of services that you access through the thing that can also move. When? Now. It already exists today, but it exists in very specific use cases. So, for example, there are autonomous shuttles running between car parks and terminals at airports all over the world, and more being introduced every year. There are autonomous shuttles operating on university campuses all over the world. You can get into an autonomous taxi in Singapore or Pittsburgh today. Within defined uses, it exists. Hamburg in North Germany has announced they're going to put an autonomous bus on between the harbour side and the centre of town. The real question is again, it's not about the technology itself, it's about the technology's ability to become ubiquitous in all circumstances, and in particular, at what point are we comfortable that the safety means that it doesn't need to be segregated from other traffic. This is, from a technical point of view, this will happen much quicker on routes between cities than it will happen in cities. And the reason for that is very simple. The processing power that you need to be able to understand a road that continues like that for 100 kilometres is very low. The processing power that you need to be able to understand that my Nissan Micra in the middle of Sao Paulo turning the corner is what it is seeing a shadow or a child in front of me. That is very difficult. So that will probably be 20 years off or more. The applications on major roads between big cities, I could see that being viable in 5 years.
Good.
Mr. Threlfall, I'm Arthur Lottenberg from Firma Consultancy. As you all addressed, Brazil has a huge pipeline of projects coming over, but in some of these projects, probably we'll have some situation according to the ESG and sustainability situations. We have Ferrogrão, which is a railway going from Mato Grosso to Pará. We have a block of airports in the Amazon. How do you see the foreign interest in these kinds of projects, considering all of the situations you addressed?
Thank you. So, I think you... firstly, I'm not necessarily sure that either of the two examples that you give would be in the too difficult box. So, yes, the climate debate has started to focus very heavily on the carbon impact of flying, but that isn't leading investors to say, well, we accept that nobody should fly and we won't invest in airports. Where we are seeing the pressure points today are particularly around the extractive industries. So it's, as the example I gave, anything to do with coal, oil, and gas is the difficult place. Of course, this is the biggest single investment area in Brazil. There is still today enough of an ecosystem of industries that fundamentally depend in that space for it to be perfectly viable for the the next 5 years or so. But you need to be aware that even the biggest players within, for example, the oil and gas industry, are desperately trying to reposition themselves so that they can defend, if you like, their environmental, social and governance credentials. Let me give you an example. We are doing a significant piece of work globally with Chevron at the moment. And the brief is very simple. They've said, we want every single facility that we've got globally to be fully powered by renewable energy within the shortest possible timescale you can manage. And in some cases, the renewable energy exists within that particular country, in which case it's a matter of negotiating the necessary agreements for them to take supply simply from that provider. But in some cases, the renewable energy capacity doesn't exist. So they've said, well, build it for us. We will have, for every single one of those sites, we will effectively contract our own renewable energy source. Now, that doesn't change the fact they're still an extractive industry. But I think the point I'm trying to make is there's something really important about having thought about the question, having thought about what is the public position, what is the view that's being expressed, how are you marketing it? The day that somebody goes onto the streets and starts campaigning against the fact you're doing this, what's the defence, what's the reaction? So it's not that it becomes a barrier immediately to investment, but it becomes a risk, a significant risk that needs to be thought through and managed proactively starting now.
Anyone else, either here or on my back? So I think we should close now. Thank you once again, Richard, for this very interesting conversation. I hope this is the first time you come here, but not the last one. So hope to see you soon in the future.
Thank you so much.
Mauricio, thank you so much for the opportunity. Abraço a todos.